Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I'm really excited. This is now the second Australian interview that I get to do. So it is my early evening and my guest's early morning. So I'm so happy to make this work. We've already been gushing about Stuart Barnes, who, if you haven't listened to his episode, it is out when this interview comes out. So listen back to it. I'm joined with Nigel Featherstone. First, I just love his last name. It's like very proper, as if it's a very professorial title. So Nigel is, as I said, an Australian writer. He has published widely. We are going to be talking mostly about his newest novel. It's called My Heart is a Little Wild Thing. It's out now from Ultimo Press. And his other novel is called Bodies of Men, and it's classified as a war novel. So we'll definitely touch upon it because we've done a little war discussions with writers before. So I want to bring that queer themed aspect into it, Nigel. That was published by, we got the name right, Hachette Australia in 2019. It was longlisted for the 2020 ARA Historical Novel Prize, shortlisted for the 2020 ACT Book of the Year, shortlisted in the 2019 Queensland Literary Awards, and received a 2019 Canberra Critics Circle Awards. So it's very widely received and awarded. So I'm so excited to be joined with you, Nigel, and just have this conversation.
It's so wonderful to be here and lovely to see you, Andrew.
Yes, yes. So, well, first, I'm just curious, where in Australia, like what region are you coming to me from?
So technically, coming from New South Wales, so our big city is Sydney, but mostly I live in a regional town called Goulburn, which is about 2.5 hours south of Sydney, a town of about 20,000 people. But it's actually only 80 kilometres north of Canberra, the national capital. And so the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, is like this little island that is surrounded by New South Wales. And so most of my week I spend crossing that border. I actually go between New South Wales into the ACT and back out again. So I live officially in New South Wales, but I spend a lot of time in the national capital.
Yeah, well, and I've been saying to you, Stuart, uh, Lindsay Tuggle, who everyone out there, she's going to be an upcoming interview. She's a poet, and I knew her first as a Whitman scholar. And well, she is a Whitman scholar, but she's a poet as well. And I'm so naive with Australia. Basically, I think of Sydney, the Sydney Opera House, the Olympics. But then because of that movie, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, that's basically my queer knowledge of Australia. And because wait, there's Sydney, and then there's another the beach city, or one that's like right by the water. Maybe what am I? I'm trying to think. What's
So
the
Sydney is right on the harbour. It's got the harbour, but also then it's got Bondi, which is the famous Sydney beach, and that's really part of Sydney. And then Melbourne is in Victoria, down on the south side. But anyone, for me, like I grew up in Sydney, and there's a big rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. So essentially a Sydney side, I always think Melbourne is nothing. But then
Melbourne?
again,
Yes, yes.
Sydney's got the Mardi Gras and has had the Mardi Gras since 1978. That's queer central for Sydney. And a little fun fact: when I first watched Priscilla, and absolutely adored it, of course, I kid you not, I was watching that movie, and right at the beginning, there's a little protest scene, and
Hmm.
there's a guy with a megaphone talking. That is my family doctor.
Oh wow. Okay, so everyone, we
Pure
have to rewatch Priscilla, Queen
uh,
of the Desert.
pure coincidence. He's now died, but he was a family doctor for 20 or 30 years. And I remember thinking, that's Dr. Lucas. And then I said to my now late mother, what would that have been, Dr. Lucas? And she said, oh yeah, he was an amateur, an actor, so that would have been him. So how bizarre.
Well, and how large is Sydney, like population wise?
Oh, I think it's up to it's only about 5 or maybe 6, maybe, oh look, I don't know, 7 or 8 million.
Okay,
So
so it's on a
not
New York City, like Manhattan, Brooklyn scale with
it's our big
population.
big city, and it sprawls a long, long way. I think the newest suburb from the center of Sydney is now 80 kilometers out of the city. It's a sprawling metropolis. So,
Yeah, I'm such a
and
New
for
York-based person, so everything is
yes,
always, is it like Manhattan? Even when I was in San Francisco for the first time, I was always thinking, is this like Manhattan?
well, it's
And
funny, and when I have traveled and gone to other big cities, I've been to New York State, but I've never actually been to New York City. But when I have been to other cities, I think, okay, these are big cities. But in the times since, I think Sydney was only like 2 million when I was growing up. It's certainly quadrupled, and and there's no way I could drive in Sydney anymore. I always catch the train just because it's too much. So
yeah, well, this artistic energy is bringing me to Australia. I'll be ready for it.
you should you should
I love flights too, so actually that won't be the problem.
you
Uh,
should come out for a Mardi Gras and enjoy that.
yeah, when is the Mardi Gras?
It's in March. It's in the beginning of
Oh,
March.
okay, I have
Yeah,
time. I can plan this.
you can
Uh,
plan. Yeah.
yes, yes. So what I'm so curious about, Nigel, is how you got into creative writing. Was this something that you had always growing up thought I'm going to be a writer, or did this come through another career pathway? How does this enter into your journey?
So yeah, interesting question, and I think it's probably the answer is both of those. I certainly loved reading when I was a child, and my mother, I've got two older brothers, and she would always take us to the local library, and she would make us a little library bag with our name sort of stitched into it, and we'd go every month to the local library, and that would be our reading for the next month. Um, and she was also a bookseller. And so reading was very important from a very young age. And I think that, I still, even now, with you asking me that question, I still get that sort of body memory of choosing the books that I'd read for the next month and then going home and opening the book. And, because that was basically our entertainment. There was television and radio, of course, but at night it would always be, where's my book at? Where I'm at with this story. Um, and then I have my father, now late father, was a painter. I was a visual artist, and I also had a queer poet in my family, someone called Dorothy Porter, and so even though I had sort of Dorothy, who was the eldest cousin, and she's now she sadly died of breast cancer at the age of 54, but um, even though I had my father and Dorothy in my life, and wanting to be a writer, it was always that kind of middle class thing of, well, you can't be a writer though, can you?
Hmm.
So it was the only thing that I was good at as a kid. I clearly remember being about being about 16, and I was moved from the average English class to an advanced English class, the only time that ever happened in my whole schooling. And I wrote this story, and I thought, yep, I've impressed my new English teacher. And then when he was handing out the marks, he put it back on my little desk, student desk, and he said, "You can do better than that." And I went, "Well, next story, I'm going to blitz you then. I'm going to impress you." And yeah, and I actually wrote, at age 16, I wrote a war short story about two boys who, in their little town, all the men go off to war, and these two boys have to grow up to become men, because they're not old enough to go to war. But when the men come back, they're all completely lost because they're now old, but they no longer have all these, mature things to do. And anyway, Andrew, I remember going, I've worked on it, I've worked on it, I've worked on it, I've worked on it. And funny enough, I wrote the whole story to the Brideshead Revisited soundtrack, the old BBC,
Oh,
the
wow.
original BBC version. And I remember the teacher, still remember his name, Peter Goldsby Smith. He was handing, and I got 17 and a half out of 20. And he was handing out all the other assignments and marks, and he was going 16, 15, 17. I went, no, I'm still better, I'm still better, still better. And he got to the last kid and he went 18 to this other kid. And I remember thinking, oh, I didn't get there. I didn't get the best mark. And then this kid got up because he could read his story. And it was a complete rip-off of a children's story I'd had at home.
Oh,
Complete rip-off. It was a complete plagiarism. And I remember thinking there, as a 16-year-old, I thought I've got two choices. I could put up my hand and say, he's got a better mark, but he ripped off. And I'll sound really sour and bitter, or I'll just sit with that news and know that I did the best anyway. And I
well, and
thought,
it's that ingenuity, right? I mean, you were doing original work.
uh,
I remember even when I was in an AP English class, I was um questioning I think she wasn't the valedictorian, but she was up there in our class. And she went to UPenn and she was complaining about an essay in our English course. And I like actually said to her, "You're going to University of Pennsylvania. You should be getting used to writing. Like this is something." But then I started to realize, oh, sometimes the highest achieving marks or the highest achieving grades of a student doesn't necessarily mean they're passionate about the subject.
no, no, indeed, they've just got a particular way of thinking that might sort of fit another particular way of thinking, maybe. And so, and interesting enough, and this sort of story has a bit of a coda. I'd go on to write short stories and get them published in Australian literary journals, and I'd had my first novel published by then. And I was walking up the big main avenue in Canberra, and this is, I'm not making a word of this up. This is maybe 20 or 30 years later, and I was walking up where there was a hotel, and there was a hotel foyer, and there was a sandwich board, and clearly there was some kind of conference was on. And I was just walking along, and there was two guys talking on the street, on the footpath, and I went, that's my English teacher. That's Peter Goldsby Smith. I'm sure it is. And I kept walking and I went, no, 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 do it. Do a Yui and say something to this, to him. And I said, I'm so sorry for interrupting your conversation, but Peter, I don't really remember me. My name's Nigel Featherstone. I was once your English teacher. And, you once told me I could do better, and I did do better. But more to the point, I'm now a published writer. And he smiled, his face lit up, and he said, well, good on you. And I knew you would one day do it. And so it was just I think in a way, Andrew, what I'm still doing 40 years after that event at school, I'm still just trying to impress people. I'm still just trying to write in a way that will move people, and maybe just move people. That's what I'm still that kid who just wants to do better and move people.
And I always, when I talk to writers, especially um, fictional writers, I
Yeah,
find even if poets, fiction writers, I think nonfiction, it's a little different sometimes. Like that's where I see a similarity to academic writers. But
yeah,
with creative writers, I find that the stereotype from the public is more of that bookworm, like even myself, like where I've arrived now and having this conversation with you. My mom always took me to the library once a week as well. So I really
yeah,
bond with you over that. And
yeah.
like I still love the aesthetic of a library and just
Yes.
in my hometown, I'll always go and visit their library when I go see my family. But here on Long Island, I have just such a community there. And there's the library magazines and like what's the newest books that are coming out. And you see all of the new fiction and nonfiction. And I just love making my way through even they have record players you can rent at the library here.
Wow. Yeah.
So they have a 3D printer. I mean, it's just so interesting to see where libraries, all the activities and movies, it's such a cultural center. And what I find interesting though is when I was younger, I was a very more introspective, introverted reader.
Yeah.
Now I'm extroverted, but still have that literary thirst.
Wonderful.
Um, but there's something about when you're with a book, even when it's an audiobook, there's something about that solitude and introspectiveness of learning through the characterization and what that author has created um that I always want to ask, like, do you feel, Nigel, that you would describe yourself in a very more introverted way? Like, are you that introverted writer, reader, or are you able to be um an exuberant, extroverted person while still being able to write? Like, do you have to kind of tune out certain noise when you're in that writing process?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why I love living in regional Australia is that it's so quiet. There's where I live. There's actually no literary community, but what's amazing is just an hour down the road is a massive reading community. It's quite extraordinary. Um, and also I can be an absolute hermit, and I'm sort of someone, and maybe when I was younger, I would be embarrassed to say this, but I'm the sort of person who, for every hour of socializing, I need 9 hours to not socialize. And in the past, I think, what's wrong with me? Why do I have to be so introverted? And I just love it. I just love being in the house. I love writing. I love reading. I love, I've got chickens in the backyard, and I love walking in the bush, and I'm just very happy doing that. And I love then coming to Canberra and socializing, and I'll do all that stuff. Last year for my Heart Is a Little Wild thing, I was at a literary festival, and I was on a panel with two very successful Australian authors, much more successful than me. One of them, Trent Dalton, who's probably the most successful writer right now, and the audience must have been in its thousands. There must have been 2 or 3 thousand people. That was a double marquee, and it was just a sea of people.
Wait,
And I
sorry,
remember
I'm so
thinking,
naive. What is his name?
Trent Dalton.
Trent Dalton. Okay. What would be
Yeah.
like the one of the works that you would recommend by Trent Dalton?
So it would be Boy Swallows Universe.
Mm, okay.
Um, and it's being turned into a television series at the moment. It's been on the stage and all this kind of thing. And he's got a bit of, he's a lovely guy. He's a very, very lovely, generous human being. But he's got a bit of rock star swagger. When he was walking through the crowd, he really was engaging people and, giving them, thumbs up and high fives and all this kind of stuff. But a very lovely guy. And I remember I really enjoyed the conversation. It was very vibrant and very funny and irreverent. But afterwards, I needed a full week just to go
Mm.
home and not because it was challenging. It was quite the opposite. It was actually the most enjoyable thing, I'd done all last year. But when I got home, I just thought, okay, that's a week's worth of me not talking to anyone. And even if so you have to get the plumber around to fix something, it's really irritating. Don't have to talk to the plumber, and so I'm very much that real introvert. But I think with reading and particularly literature, for me, particularly in this era we're in now, I just like to be disconnected from all the stuff and all the noise and just be in the world of the novel. And it's not that I'm hiding from the real world. I'm just engaged in the real world of the novel. So it's not escapism to me. And I read literature. So it's then connecting me to some kind of truth, which is what I'm really want. But I think I still am just that kid who just wants to know the characters and be interested in their lives and what happens to them.
Yeah. Well, and with your work, something like with Bodies of Men, like we have two different tones, right? Bodies of Men with genres and your themes that you have this quote unquote a war novel,
Yeah.
but with Bodies of Men, where my heart is a little wild thing, is more of processing one's journey through familial strife, familial deterioration in a way, trying to get on the other side. So with Bodies of Men, I mean, just having the term body and men in the title really brings to mind this male warrior bonding culture. And like that's where I had on Zach Topping, who wrote Wake of War, which is a dystopian war novel, very military-esque, which was very interesting. But I'm curious, like, why did you go? Like, you've already said you wrote a war short story, but like, how did you know, okay, now I have to go into a war novel? Like, what was that inspiration behind that whole theme in Bodies of Men? Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I hope you're enjoying what you're watching on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So to watch the rest of the episode, head to our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ Ivory Tower Boiler Room. That's Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And you can watch the rest of the episode on our $5 a month membership called ITBR Student, or join the ITBR Professor membership. It's only $10 a month. You get access to all of our videos. You get access to both of our book clubs, the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and the True Crime and Academia book club. Plus, you unlock all of our other episodes. So at the ITBR Student, you only get access to our weekly interviews and the True Crime and Academia episodes. For $10 a month, you get access to our ITBR rewatches, our Teaches series, and True Crime and Academia rewatches and Teaches series, plus the book clubs. Okay, can't wait to see you all on Patreon. And just a reminder, I also offer consultation services. It is $30 for your initial consultation. You get a 1 hour private Zoom with me, and I will help you whether you want to create your own podcast and or media brand, you want to navigate academia as an undergrad or grad student, you need help with technology as it relates to teaching or media. Do you want to expand your social media presence as an artist, writer, podcaster, or academic, or even crafting your public humanities identity? I will help you with my consultation services. You can also find that on Patreon as well. Okay. Thank you all for watching and for supporting the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Bye.